So, good morning, everyone. And I'm Keith McPherson, Audit Partner and Head of Charities at Henderson Logie. I'm therefore delighted to welcome you all to the latest of our series of charity trustee training events, designed to support trustees and, of course, management as well in carrying out your responsibilities. So the key question being considered today is around how confident are you that your organisation's risk assurance arrangements are robust and provide the right information at the right time to mitigate risks or indeed exploit opportunities as they arise. And you might want to keep that in mind because we're going to be asking that question later on in the programme. So in the session, David Archibald and Emma Tilley from Henderson Logie's internal audit team will be looking at a best practice approach to risk management and practical solutions to ensure charities understand the risk factors that may impact on the achievement of your strategic goals. I've been told to tell you that despite their incredible youthful looks, there is decades of risk assurance experience added up between them. Just a note for practicality, we are recording the session, so we've got about 40 minutes of the presentation, and then we'll take questions at the end. So if you ask questions through the question and answer function in the Zoom window, and not through the chat, please, but put them in the Q&A, then we will pick them up as panelists and host, and we'll answer them at the end. So now I will hand you over to David and Emma to take you through this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, as Keith said, I'm David Archibald. I'm a partner and head of our internal audit function, and you'll be pleased to hear it's not just me you have to listen to today. We're taking a tag team approach, so it'll be myself and Emma Tilley that will be delivering the bulk of the session for you today, and then Keith will come back in at the end to host the Q&A. Just a bit about Emma first. She's from a sort of audit and risk assurance background, but I thought it'd be useful in terms of, I'm kind of conscious looking at the delegate list for today, that some of you may be wondering why you have auditors here today talking to you about risk management. So I thought it might be sort of useful to give you a sort of bit of background about, my experience as head of internal audit in terms of delivering the sort of risk advisory part of our business. So I'm the sort of engagement lead for all of our internal audit clients, and that includes a number of charities, but it also includes a wide range of other bodies. So that includes colleges, universities, non-departmental public bodies, housing associations, commercial bodies, and professional bodies such as ICAS and SSSC. And a number of these bodies do have charitable status as well, over and above the ones that would perhaps badge themselves up as charities. So, this is an important part of our work. And my sort of background is in sort of audit and consultancy. So that's primarily been in the public sector, but increasingly our portfolio is expanding, and it's now including bodies in the commercial sector as well, which has been useful in terms of getting to see the way their risk management arrangements work as well. So obviously, as part of our sort of core internal audit work, risk management or the review of risk management is a really important part of what we do. So we've looked at that across charities and right across our portfolio, so the colleges, the non-departmental bodies, and in the past, and local government bodies and the NHS. And I think what that's done is give us a good picture of what works and what doesn't work. The good thing is that for charities, there is no Bible that says how you have to approach risk management. So we've seen lots of different ways of approaching this, some very good and some very bad. And hopefully we can bring some of that experience to the table today. And on top of that, I've also delivered tailored risk management training to a variety of clients across our portfolio over the years. And while I was on one of my sabbaticals from Henderson Logie, part of my responsibility was around risk management. So I had responsibility in the local authority that I worked in for the overarching strategic risk register. And then lastly, I previously was a board member for a sort of small creative arts organisation. And the reason I've mentioned that is that gave me a completely different insight around risk management. So suddenly when I was presented with a risk register, I was focused in on that mitigating actions and control column. And I was asking the question, how do I know that the picture I'm being presented with is a correct one, and therefore that we're having the right discussions and focusing the discussion on the right areas. So hopefully what this does is give you a clear picture in terms of the fact that obviously, you know, we do consultancy work in this area. We've audited risk management in the past. I've had to do risk management, so I've been perhaps in your shoes in terms of having to do the sort of practicalities of maintaining a risk register. And I've been a sort of board trustee, if you like, looking at risk registers in the past. So that's just a bit of background about me. So moving on to what we're going to cover in the session today, importantly, first part of the session we'll sort of cover, you know, what the responsibilities are, the key responsibilities, and why we bother with risk management at all in charities. And we'll come at that from a sort of trustee angle and also from a senior management angle as well. We'll then speak about the sort of definitions of risk and what do we mean by risk, and speak about sort of risk management frameworks and the various steps in that, and what good looks like, and you know, and what the sort of fundamentals are in terms of improving your risk maturity. You've maybe heard that terminology. We'll then speak a bit about risk appetite. And I suppose, you know, the reasons why you would bother setting a risk appetite, and more importantly, from my perspective, how that then connects through into your risk reporting to drive better discussions. And we'll speak a bit about the risk treatment, which for me is the important bit. You know, it's all very well identifying risk, but the important bit is what do we do next? And we'll come on to that later on. Then we'll speak about risk assurance. That's really just about where you would get the assurance, either as senior managers in your charity or as trustees. And thinking about where you can get that assurance from. Some of that will be internal within your organisation. Some of that will be from external parties. So we'll speak a bit about that and how you get that assurance, and then how you form the view in terms of have you got enough assurance around how particular risks are being managed. Then lastly, we'll touch on the ways in which we can support you in terms of improving your risk management arrangements. So I'll hand you over to Emma now, who'll take you through the first section.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, David. So the first section, we're going to look at the responsibilities of you as a trustee and within senior management in order to support your board. If you've attended any of our previous charity trustee training events, you'll have heard about your responsibilities in quite a bit of detail, but we're not going to go over all of them today. What we've done is picked out the kind of key and most relevant responsibilities in relation to risk and risk management and your requirements there. So first of all, there's a legal requirement for those charities that are required by law to have their annual accounts audited. And here we've got a statement to the effect that trustees must make a statement on their risk management arrangements and around how satisfied they feel around that their major risks are being mitigated and are being managed, and are satisfied and have confidence that their systems or procedures established to manage those risks are robust. But it's not for the trustees to do this task. They can delegate elements of risk management and the process to their staff or even professional advisors. But trustees should review and consider the key aspects of the process and any of the results from that process, all reporting, so that they can make the required risk management statement with reasonable confidence. Within OSCAR itself, as within the role of a charity trustee, you must act with care and diligence. That's one of the kind of key points that they have. But what does this mean? You have to protect your charity, including its beneficiaries, assets and reputation. This means understanding and assessing potential risks to make sure decisions are robust as possible. You should have a clear, up-to-date picture of how the charity is doing financially, and the procedures you have in place in order to reduce any risks there. The Scotland's Third Sector Governance Forum have also set out requirements. So this is for any charitable body in order to have established risk management arrangements, particularly within its 5 core principles, one of which is around control. And this principle talks about that a well-run board understands its role, powers and duties, and works collectively and proactively to achieve its organisational purposes. And within that, that's quite a mouthful, but within that it's about understanding and analysing your internal and external operating environment, and knowing not just your risks, but how your processes and procedures are working in order to manage those risks. So I'm going to hand over to David just now, who will delve further into risks and the process of risk management.
I think, you know, from our point of view, I mentioned earlier on that there's no sort of set way of approaching risk management, and anyone that has Googled risk management will know that there's lots and lots of information out there. So what we thought we'd try and do for you today was to try and sort of distill that down into sort of the key messages. So we've picked out what I think are hopefully some sort of useful definitions, if you like. And also I've got a couple of diagrams here that will hopefully sort of explain what the sort of risk maturity journey is and what the various components of that are. And then we'll look at the sort of risk management cycle in terms of how you build this into your sort of day-to-day work. So we've picked out this particular quote, and there's lots and lots of definitions there in terms of what we actually mean by risk. But I like this for this particular quote, which is drawn from the HM Treasury Orange Book for a number of reasons. One of the reasons, you know, and you can see it in the top line there, is that it speaks about uncertainty of outcome, whether positive opportunity or negative threat. And I think a lot of the times, you know, when we're reviewing risk management, what you see is that the risk register is very, very focused on negative threats. So often, you know, the bit that is missing is actually thinking about, you know, the risks of missing out on opportunities. And I think particularly for charitable bodies where perhaps, you know, you are having to think about how you're going to maybe pivot and adapt your organisation off the back of the pandemic, particularly around things like maybe fundraising or the type of activities that you support, then thinking about what those sort of positive opportunities are and the risk of missing out on those is going to be really, really important going forward in terms of the work of managers and trustees. Mentioned within the quote there that risk management includes identifying and assessing risks and then responding to them. And the reason that I like this is because, again, you know, and I'll come on to this when we come on to the diagram, often what we see is a big focus around that sort of initial identification process, and particularly managers and boards getting bogged down in the risk scoring element, which means that, you know, that's where all the discussion is perhaps at meetings, is around, you know, is it a 12, is it a 15, rather than what are we actually doing to respond to this risk. So keeping that focus on what are we doing to manage and mitigate the risk is really, really important. And in the bottom part there speaks about the sort of the resource available and the fact that they're finite. And what we're recognizing there is that, you know, the mitigating actions and controls that you have on your risk register largely require staff resource and require you to put some investment in. So really it's about having something which is proportionate. So it's thinking about, you know, what is the cost associated with these mitigating actions and controls, and is that actually aligned to the actual risk that we've identified? Because there's no point in having a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So it's making sure that it is that you can justify any work that you're putting in to manage individual risks, and that you're not over managing or over mitigating risks. And then lastly, we've mentioned there around risk appetite, and we'll come on to that later on, as I mentioned, in terms of why we would bother, and I'll maybe touch a bit on why setting the risk appetite is sort of beneficial in terms of the work of managers and board trustees. So We also thought, you know, some of you may have seen this particular document. So this was the Scottish Charity and Public Surveys, which was carried out earlier this year, and you know, obviously the sort of the point of this, if you like, was to try and identify to a certain extent what some of the barriers were to becoming a trustee. But also thinking about, you know, what are the big challenges going to be going forward for charities. Good response on this, so over 1,500 responses across a wide variety of bodies, if you like. And the sort of main issues that were coming out of this in terms of key risks and challenges going forward, very much focused around service delivery and ongoing running costs. So clearly, you know, there's been a big impact during the pandemic, but some of that is enduring. Still challenges there around recruitment, and that could be around volunteers or in terms of trustees onto your board. Where it's applicable, still challenges around sustaining membership levels. Fundraising, again, you know, what was a challenge during the pandemic, but, you know, perhaps for a lot of charities, things haven't quite recovered to those sort of pre-pandemic levels. And it's maybe, I mentioned pivoting and adapting. Maybe it's a case of thinking about different approaches around fundraising, particularly given some of the economic challenges that we have just now that are impacting on the type of people that might give donations to your charity. And then lastly, the whole question around sort of public trust. And I think what came out in this survey was that whilst there was confidence in the sector as a whole, there are still challenges at sort of individual charity level, if you like, in terms of making sure that, you know, you are seen to be operating effectively and in line with the sort of governance code that Emma managed earlier, and making sure that you are maintaining that sort of public trust in the way that you operate your charity and the way that you achieve your priorities and use the funds that are available to you. So we thought it would be useful. We kind of touched on the sort of the key question, if you like, and what we're keen to do is to run a little poll and just to sort of capture your thoughts in terms of how confident are you that, you know, that your organisation's risk management and assurance arrangements are robust. So that's about just thinking about, you know, the risk maturity in your organisation, and also thinking about the information that you're presented with. So that could be the information as a senior manager in your charity or as a trustee, and thinking about the level of detail that you get around risk and how often you get that information. So just have a think about that. You know, how confident are you about your organisation's risk management and assurance arrangements? And we'll just give you a minute or so just to give us a response on one of these 5 choices, and then we'll come back to it and sort of maybe summarize what the thoughts are in terms of the people that are on the session today. Okay, so a mixed picture there, as we can see. So thankfully, nobody's saying that they're not confident at all. 24% of people saying slightly confident. Big group in the middle there, who are not sure, maybe need a bit more information before they were able to sort of come to a conclusion on it. And I think that's helpful for us in terms of particularly the risk assurance piece that we'll come on to later on, in terms of how you get the assurance, in terms of how the framework is operating, and get assurance that risks are being managed appropriately. But good to see that we've got, you know, 32% are fairly confident, and a decent sized tranche, 12%, saying that they're very confident with the arrangements. I mean, what I would say on that is, obviously, this is about getting something that works for your organisation. So you could be very confident, but still not in a position where the work is done. I don't think anyone has ever said that the risk management is done and that they can just park it and not worry about it. So everyone's on a sort of risk maturity journey, if you like. But that's interesting to see the sort of spread of responses across everyone that's on the session today. Okay. So in terms of what an effective risk management framework is, as I say, I thought we'd take you through a couple of diagrams, which hopefully are useful.
So this is when I'm going to talk you through, first of all, the HM Treasury Orange Books framework on what they constitute as an effective risk management framework. We want to be able to kind of build on the confidence that we noted within your poll. So by walking through what constitutes an effective risk management framework, will hopefully either give you assurance or on your arrangements, or allow you to see where there may be requirements for enhancements. As David alluded to, there's no one size that fits all. Within the established risk management framework, it's to ensure that you have one that fits your organisation and the size of your organisation. But the first aspect of that the HM Treasury Orange Book highlights is that there should be effective governance and leadership. And that's about you as in the role of trustee, setting the tone from the top of how risk management should be within your organisation, and delegating that requirement to your staff or accounting officer. Within that, your accounting officer should ensure that there is the policies in place that support that tone and your appetite around risk, and giving chance for discussion around risks that may be emerging, as well as ones that have been identified. And you should ensure that roles and responsibilities are also clear at all management levels in order to support that effective governance framework that you have there. So this might mean that you designate an individual who's responsible for leading the organisation's approach to risk management, rather than taking all the responsibilities on yourself. The second element is that it should be an integral part to all your organisation's activities. And this means ensuring that risk management is part of your setting of your strategy and any kind of corporate plans or service plans. It should be there when you are evaluating options or delivering programmes and projects, or any changes in policies. And it should also be considered when you're prioritising resource, or when you're reviewing your performance as well. Within that, your accounting officer should ensure that risks are transparent and considered as part of any option appraisals, and when evaluating options during decision making. The third aspect of an effective risk management framework is that it's collaborative and informed. Now, certainly functions within an organisation and your charity have a key role in that, in identifying and assessing risks as they emerge and escalating those throughout the management structure. But equally, there's a collaborative approach, perhaps out with your charity into other organisations and public sector, private sector, or even other third sector partners that you may have, in order to ratify those risks that are emerging or look for a common response. The informed aspect of this framework is to ensure that you are informed, and your functional leads are your experts in providing judgment and advice around the nature and extent that these risks may have on your charity, and they're also fundamental in the design and the operation of the internal control environment. The fourth aspect is to make sure that your risk management framework is structured. Now, David's going to talk about this in a wee bit more detail. He talked about some of the diagrams that we've got and models that we've got coming up. So I'm not going to delve into that just now. But the last point is that your risk management framework should be continually reviewed and monitored to ensure that it's effective. And that means tapping in and looking at your arrangements maybe on an annual basis in order to make sure, do they still make sense? Is there anything else that's emerged within our sector that we should be considering within our framework? So I'm going to pass you back to David just now, and he's going to talk you through the risk management process itself.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, as I touched on earlier on, you say there's lots of different diagrams out there, but I particularly like these two. And this first one is around the sort of risk management process. So I mentioned sort of risk maturity and sort of risk journey that people are on all the time. And for me, this diagram is quite good in terms of sort of summing up what the sort of fundamental steps are, if you like, are in terms of getting to good risk maturity. And obviously the starting point, Emma touched on it earlier, is about having clarity in terms of policies and procedures around your risk management. And a big part of that is just making it clear about who's supposed to be doing what. So what are the responsibilities there? And that's responsibilities for trustees and managers and then staff right down throughout the organisation. Defining objectives, that's really just about making sure that whatever risks you are identifying do link back into the objectives that have been set for the organisation. There's no point in trying to manage risks that won't impact on what you're trying to deliver as a charity. There needs to be a process there for how you identify the risks. So having that sort of clarity in terms of how you go about identifying the risks. And the big danger here is that you end up with a mixture of quite strategic, high-level risks and really operational risks. So having a sort of methodology that makes sure that you've got risks that are at the same level is really, really important. And then having a mechanism there, and I think most people are sort of familiar with the sort of a risk matrix type model where perhaps you're scoring on a likelihood or impact basis to come up with a risk score, if you like, which helps you sort of prioritise. And then it's about determining the response. So often, as I mentioned earlier on, this is the bit that's often missing, is this focus on what do we do next? You know, we've scored, we've identified the risks, we've had a good discussion about that, we're confident we've got the right risks, we've scored them, but what do we do next? And that then needs to feed through in terms of your reporting. And that's not just reporting to the board, you know, that's your ongoing reporting and the discussions that are happening at management level as well, in terms of, you know, have any of these risks changed? Are there any new risks emerging? And what do we need to do in terms of our approach if perhaps what you've got in as a mitigating action and control isn't working? And I think if any one part of this starts to fail, then it impacts on the outcome that you'll get from the whole risk management process. So if we can move on to the next one. This is more around the sort of ongoing risk management cycle. So we speak about risk management being embedded and becoming part of your sort of day-to-day work. And if we start at the middle, clearly, you know, you need someone to have that sort of risk oversight, you know, and in some organizations that is the board, in others that's sort of delegated to a board subcommittee. But it's having that clarity in terms of who's got that responsibility for making sure there is a framework in place, that it's being followed, and that, you know, there is that oversight in terms of the management of those risks. But the first step, if we look on the right-hand side, is around actually identifying the risk. And as I say, it's about consistency in terms of the way that you go about identifying those risks and setting those out on the risk register. Then it's about using the sort of established methodology and everyone following that methodology. So you get consistency in terms of scoring on impact and likelihood. And then beyond that, it's thinking about, well, what happens next? So what is our response to this going to be? Is it around accepting the risk? Is it about sharing it? Is it about taking some action to mitigating it? Or is there any way to avoid this risk altogether? And then beyond that, it's thinking about, in terms of the things that you're going to try and mitigate and control yourselves, it's actually assigning that to someone so that they know there is a plan, it's written down, and people know that they have a responsibility for managing those individual risks. And then beyond that, you know, we mentioned there around sort of monitoring performance, that's about feeding it through into your reporting mechanisms. And a big part of that, back to my experience as a board trustee, a big part of that is actually about demonstrating where you're getting the assurance from. And as I mentioned earlier, some of that is internal through your own perhaps self-assessment processes and compliance processes. Some of it might be from external advisors, so that could be from internal audit, external audit, or from other external bodies. But it's about how you get that assurance and therefore how comfortable you are that things are being managed to an appropriate level. And if you can get this cycle going and working, then you know hopefully what that does is remove the barriers, the risks to you achieving those overall strategic objectives for your charity. In order to sort of achieve that and to embed it, clearly we've got to have that connection between the risks back to the sort of charity's purpose. So there has to be that sort of golden thread from the risks, you know, back to the strategic objectives that you've set out for yourselves. So clearly that, you know, Emma mentioned, you know, the best way to do that is to integrate risk management and think about what the risks are at the point that you're pulling together your strategic plan, rather than it being an afterthought. As part of that, you've got to think about what, you know, not just what the priorities are within your strategic plan, but thinking about all the actions that you're going to have to deliver that underpin that. So that's thinking about your workforce planning and the people element of it. It could be around your estate strategy, it could be around your IT strategy, and thinking about all the things that you will need to deliver those overarching strategic priorities, and therefore what the risks are to deliver on those that will stop you achieving those overall priorities. We've mentioned financial budgets there, and that's really just about making sure that, you know, you are thinking about, you know, we mentioned that there is a cost associated with managing these risks, and it's about making sure that, you know, if we have mitigating actions and controls in there, that we're comfortable that there are resources there to deliver that. There's no point saying that we're going to do something when the money's not there to deliver it. Excuse me. Beyond that, you know, one of the things that we often work with organisations on is how they can link their risk arrangements to their performance management arrangements, and particularly their targets. And part of the reason why we see this as being really important is because actually the performance information that you're gathering, in particular where you are in terms of delivering against the targets, is a really good sort of early warning indicator in terms of risk starting to crystallise. So if you can connect those two things together and join the dots, then that's really, really helpful in terms of identifying where risks are and where they're starting to maybe increase or for new risks to be introduced into your risk register, perhaps where you're not delivering against your targets. And then lastly, we mentioned there about how you would connect it to the risk appetite, and that's really about how you're driving better discussions going forward. So in terms of risk appetite, fair to say there's two schools of thoughts on this. Some people see it as being extremely useful. There are lots of people that think it's a complete and utter waste of time. I'm very much in the former camp, and I think it's really, really important that board trustees set the risk appetite, and that what's particularly helpful is if management are in the room when that process happens. So they've got you've got a shared understanding of what the attitude to different types of risk is. So your risk appetite process is scoring the risk appetite for different categories of risk rather than individual risks on your risk register. And that recognises that perhaps your attitude as a board to legal and regulatory compliance might be completely different to some other more operational types of risks. But it's important to make sure that the board has defined that risk appetite, and, you know, going forward, you know, what is a challenge for lots of organisations, and I'll come on to this in a little case study that I've got, is how you connect that through into your risk reporting. So in terms of what the purpose is of setting a risk appetite, again, this is drawn from the HM Treasury guidance. And what it says is that by determining the amount of risk it is prepared to accept, the board is able to improve organisational control, enhance decision making, making, revitalise performance, recognise how to reduce risks, and make better decisions on the deployment of resources to the delivery of objectives. Now, there's a lot in there. There's a lot to unpack. But for me, this is just about having that shared understanding of what the attitude to different types of risks, and driving, as I said, those better discussions, and focusing in particular on those risks where the residual risk level on the risk register is sitting above the risk appetite. I think it's very easy to focus the discussion at the board or at your board subcommittee around anything new, anything changed, or let's just look at the red risks, when you might have something which is sitting in the middle of the pack that's maybe an amber risk on your risk register, but it's still above the level that the board has set in terms of the risk appetite. So actually having that understanding in terms of what is acceptable for different types of risks and managing against that. And that could be, as I touched on earlier on, that could be a discussion around, are we over managing here? You know, me as a board may be particularly relaxed about particular types of risks, and therefore you don't have to have the same focus in terms of mitigating actions and controls to manage those going forward. But, you know, for me, it's about having that shared understanding and focusing the discussion around where the residual risk level is above the risk appetite level that's been set by the board. So in terms of how you would implement that in practice, I mentioned that, you know, I've got a little sort of case study, and this relates to a client, which was a charitable body, where I was asked to come in and run a session with board trustees. And what they wanted done was a session which effectively explained the responsibilities of the board around risk management. We had a look at their sort of risk register and the risk categories that they had on there, and we did a bit of tidying up on that. And then we went into a session that was about risk appetite and scoring the risk appetite against the HM Treasury Orange Book. So the purpose of that, as I've just outlined, was to then sort of lead in and feed into their reporting. So within that organisation, there were a number of changes on the board, and I went back to that organisation a couple of years down the line, and did a session to the new board. And one of the questions that I asked them was, well, how did the session that we had a couple of years ago, we did the work around risk appetite, how did that actually feed into your risk reporting? And their answer was, well, it hasn't. Risk reporting hasn't changed at all. So they'd gone to the effort of bringing in an independent party to work with the board and score the risk appetite, and effectively it had just sat in a drawer for 2 years. And the reason that had happened was because they couldn't connect the work that we'd done on the risk appetite to the risk register. So what we've started to do is actually agree, as part of that risk appetite setting process, how you would marry up the scoring, the risk appetite scoring, to the scoring that you have on your risk register. And what that allows you to then do is to have that more focused discussion, either at the board or at your board subcommittee, around the areas where a risk is perhaps, despite all the efforts that you put into to manage and mitigate that risk, are still sitting above the risk appetite level. So having that connectivity between the two, and it is tricky, you know, is an important part of the risk appetite process. So, you know, I don't know whether this is familiar to anyone on the call who's maybe been through this, but, you know, I think some of the skepticism around this risk appetite, I think from board trustees that I encounter, comes from the fact that they've gone through a risk appetite exercise and then nothing has happened in terms of connecting it across to the routine risk reporting. So getting that part right is really, really important. And in terms of the sort of strategies, you know, we spoke about, you know, what happens next. And again, this is an area where I don't see a huge amount of discussions, you know, by trustees with senior management in terms of what are we doing to manage these individual risks. And it's recognizing that, you know, there are broadly 4 approaches that you can take. So, you know, for some risks, you are able to transfer that risk completely. You may, you know, through some sort of contractual arrangement or what have you, you can pass that risk on. You may decide that you want to avoid the risk. So that could be in terms of, you know, some kind of insurance or sort of liability cover there to try and avoid it completely. Or you may decide that, you know, you are going to try and manage and mitigate that risk yourself. And clearly what that requires is an element of business as usual a lot of the time, in terms of making sure that you've got a control environment and that's operating effectively. And to a certain extent, that's where internal audit can come in terms of giving you that assurance as board trustees that that's working effectively. But it's also making sure that if you need to do something differently and there's an action there, that action is assigned to a manager, and they have a timescale for doing it, and you're taking that forward, and the trustees are confident that that's been done in a time frame that they're comfortable with. And then lastly, sometimes you may just have a risk that you have on your risk register that you realize that there's not an awful lot you can do to manage that. And if that is at a level with the mitigating actions to control that you're quite happy just to accept that risk and carry it, then that's okay. But again, it's about having that mature discussion as a board and making sure that you're comfortable that if you are just going to carry a risk and accept it, that everyone is on board and has that same shared view.
So I'm going to come back in here just now. So we're aware that many organisations invest heavily in risk management, and the benefits of identifying and managing strategic and operational risks within the risk appetite are widely recognised. But we realise that board trustees often are asked to take a leap of faith in assessing the true impact of mitigating actions, and the assurance requirements are there. Now, I'm conscious of time, and we've probably only got a couple of minutes left. We touched in the discussions earlier on about how internal audit can act as independent and providing unbiased assurance to you. But equally, there's other roles within the organisation that can also support your assurances as a trustee. First of all, and this is a model that you can have a look at in your own time, it's from the Institute of Internal Auditors. It's taken from, it's evolved from the 3 lines of defence, or 3 lines of assurance model, as it's now called. The first line is really your management and the assurances that they provide you on the services that they're providing in the operating environment. And I guess that, as I said earlier, the risks that might be arising from the shop floor as such. Your second line of defence or assurance that you have here is in your own, whether you have a quality team or a compliance team as such, and providing you that and slightly independent assurance on arrangements and the control environment that you're operating. But here, where internal audit and other bodies such as the HSC or even OSCAR and external audit can come in as providing you that, I guess, that external independent assurance. What you might be using in your own organisations in order to coordinate all of this, because I guess trustees can almost kind of feel overwhelmed by the amount of information that's coming up through these reporting lines, is certainly by developing what's known as a risk assurance map. Now, this is an image that's taken from the HM Treasury Orange Book, but you can adapt this from your strategic risk register, and therefore identify the kind of key elements that are affecting your charity. You can also use it to then identify where in your management structure are you getting those reports from at that first line? Where are you getting that information from that second line? And where are you getting that independent assurance around those, maybe the kind of higher growth risks that you might have identified? But again, going back to that leap of faith, the perceptions of what is good assurance and how much assurance trustees are getting can also, it's hard to interpret, and in particular for senior management, they might have one perception, whereas trustees have another perception. We at Henderson Logie have developed a risk assurance diagnostic, which is free on our website, so you can kind of tap into that afterwards. And what this allows us to do by asking trustees and board members as a group and as senior management themselves as another group, we're able to compare and contrast those perceptions and where there might be gaps, and that allows then management to address where those gaps are. Now, we've got a case study. We don't have time to run through this, where we had worked with a charitable body before, but again, you can read this in your own time. You'll get the slides after this webinar. But I guess ultimately, by using this diagnostic, it was the first footing to have that conversation about where those strengths were, where those weaknesses were, and we in internal audit were able to come in and support management to I guess, strengthen those existing risk management arrangements, but also facilitate discussion around those risks. What should be, I guess, added on, and how do they apply their risk appetite, and consequently create confidence for senior management and the trustees in the adapted and new risk management framework. I guess going back to how that question that we posed, how confident you feel your organisation's risk management and assurance arrangements are. Some of you had reported back to us that you're kind of middle of the road. What this diagnostic, and you'll see the link here, will do is be able to bring that to life under 10 risk factors, and you'll be able to see, okay, well, there's maybe something here that we need to work on. So I'm going to hand you back to David, who will quickly run through how else we can help.
So just picking up on Emma's point about the risk diagnostic, just to make one very quick point, I think what was really powerful about that exercise that we did with the diagnostic with the charitable body that Emma mentioned was that, you know, it was completed, you know, we were able to see the difference in the perceptions between senior management and the board. So to a certain extent, there was some crossover, so there was some commonality in terms of the responses, but there were other areas where the board were saying to us, we are not comfortable that we do get the level of detail and we get the information that we need at the frequency that we want it to give us that assurance around these specific risks. So management thought that they were giving that information to board trustees, but we were able to sort of close that gap. So what that did was sort of change, perhaps maybe not what was being reported, but maybe the frequency, or in some cases it was about around the board saying, no, we want a bit more detail. We need a bit more assurance around these particular risks. But in terms of, you know, some of the challenges that was spoken about today, there are ways in which we can help. So we mentioned a few of these here. So, you know, one is to deliver the sort of interactive risk management session that I mentioned earlier on, which will go through things like the responsibilities, could involve, you know, things like a critique of your risk management framework, your risk within that your risk register. Beyond that, we can do standalone sessions around risk appetite, and a big part of that is about making sure that it does connect across into your routine reporting, so that you don't end up in the same situation as the body that I mentioned earlier on. We can sort of facilitate although we've made it available to you free today, we can sort of facilitate that in terms of analysing the results that would come out of the risk assurance diagnostic, and run a session for maybe a joint session with management and the board as well, if that's something that we've done previously. And then lastly, we do have experience in terms of doing the risk assurance mapping. I mean, the diagram that Emma put up, you know, it looks quite challenging, and it is a bit of work to get it set up. But I think once it is set up, it doesn't actually need an awful lot of work to keep it going. And what that does is it just provides a sort of visual to trustees in terms of where they are going to get the assurance from. So, and identifies any gaps. So again, that's back to the sort of issues that we would draw out in the diagnostic. So, as I say, for those that were perhaps scored at the lower end of the poll earlier on, there are options here in terms of some help that you can get to help with your risk maturity. Okay, so I'll hand you back to Keith now, who's going to sort of facilitate the Q&A.
Thank you, David, and also thank you, Emma, for that very comprehensive run through on the topic of risk management all the way through. As I've said, we've managed to still have a few minutes left over for questions. If you've got any kind of burning questions that you want to ask, then, as I said at the start, if you can type them into the Q&A box. You don't need to worry, they only come through to the panelists, so nobody sees exactly who's raising all those questions. Maybe while you're thinking about that, I'm going to come back to maybe Emma. You talked about that kind of leap of faith that trustees are maybe needing to make sometimes on assurance. In terms of, kind of, getting a first foot in the door, or sort of focusing their assurance on some of the mitigating actions, any kind of tips for, where to kind of focus quickly, if maybe time is tight and they're just trying to get up and running with the process?
Yeah, I guess your strategic risk register will hopefully support you in seeing where your kind of high gross risks might be, and certainly that will then allow you to prioritise and focus on those high impact risks, and certainly where the likes of, if you're kind of looking at the scoring, where your current internal control environment is maybe not bringing that inherent risk below your risk appetite, but certainly your risk register should help you inform that level of priority.
Okay.
Keith, can I maybe come in just very, very quickly? And it was just to say, I ran a session with a client last week with their board, and one of the questions I said to them was, where should you be focusing your attention in terms of these discussions? And what the sort of the favourite answer that came out was thinking about where there was a big gap between the gross risk and the net risk, if you like. So what trustees are being told in that scenario is that look at all the things that we're doing to manage that risk. So it starts off at red and it ends up at green, so there's nothing for you to worry about. So my question to them, once they decided that's what they should be focusing on, was, well, is that what you talk about? And the answer was no, because routinely they just talk about the red risks on the risk register. So going forward, I think that will help in terms of driving more focused discussions around, how do we know that where it starts, the leap of faith, how do we know that where you're tearing it gets, where it gets to at the net risk is actually a true reflection of where we are.
Yeah. Okay, that's useful. Well, one question that's come through at the moment, I think, David, you'd mentioned that risks should be at the same level and not necessarily a mix of, for example, organisational and project risks. And I think the question is just around elaborating why you shouldn't have risks of different levels, or what you meant by that.
I think what we've seen in a number of clients is, and I understand why it happens, having been, as I mentioned in the past, responsible for maintaining a risk register, is particularly if you're in an organisation where there are changes in management, changes in the board over time. What tends to happen is that the risks get added to the risk register without necessarily taking risks off. And what happens is that different people come at things from a slightly different angle. So what you could end up with is actually lots of areas where there's overlap. That perhaps if you actually were to sit down and look at it in totality at the risk register, it may well be that you've effectively got the same issue captured under 3 or 4 different risks. So Emma mentioned about the need for regular review, and that's why sort of best practice is that you would come back and do a whole board look at your risk register annually. And a big part of that is making sure that you don't have that sort of overlap. And often how that manifests itself is that you might have for example, you might have an overarching risk on there around financial sustainability, but then you might have another risk on there that's around not achieving your fundraising targets. These two, one is a subset of the other, so it's just watching out for that overlap, if you like, and making sure that if you do have distinct risks on there, that that they are mutually exclusive and that there's no overlap there, because then it ends up muddying the waters, particularly when you get into the mitigating actions and controls.
Sure. Well, actually, I think probably in a sense, our next question kind of leads on a little bit from that, around the balance between strategic risks and perhaps operational risks, and you know the time that the Board of Trustees have to view on multiple risks. So, looking for any guidance on maybe the number of strategic risks that should be focused on. I think the questioner admits should be difficult, or to put a precise number, but any kind of ideas or guidance you can provide?
I think the best way to have a sort of manageable number of risks is to have that connection across. So think about what each of the key priorities are within your overarching strategic plan, and then think what are the key risks which would stop us achieving that. Now, unless you've got an unmanageable number of strategic priorities, in which case that's probably a bigger issue than your risk register, then that should mean that you've got a manageable number of risks. But that to a certain extent is why I was talking about trying to keep that separation between the strategic and operational risks as well. Is that if you start to bring in all the operational risks and have those discussions at the board, then to a certain extent, you can't see the wood for the trees. That's not to say that you shouldn't be thinking about what those operational risks are and managing them at management level. And obviously there needs to be a mechanism there to let board trustees that those discussions are happening, and that if an operational risk gets to such a stage that it needs escalated onto the strategic risk register, that there's a process there for doing that. But a big part of that is just about having a named individual against it, and that's where it starts to get messy if you start to mix them up, or if you have too many. And lots of organisations will speak about having a risk owner. We've got into organisations where we've gone and interviewed risk owners, and they didn't even know that they were a risk owner, which answered my second question, which is what are you doing to manage these risks? Because the answer is nothing, because they didn't know that it was aligned to them. So having a manageable number means that, and having that clarity in terms of not necessarily who is actually taking the mitigating action, but who is responsible for making sure that it does happen is really, really important. But I think if you can link it back to your strategic priorities, then that's a big help in terms of stopping you growing to a stage where, that you're over 2-3 pages and board trustees are saying that they can't read the risk register, which is a common complaint, and that's because you've got too many.
I think good advice through there. I suppose maybe just finally, probably given the time, slightly more a comment, I suppose, about a board that someone works with, where the problems are defining the mitigation strategy and the actions, where sometimes those actions don't always make a difference to the risk. I guess in a sense, this comes back to where you were talking about whether there's just some risks you maybe have to accept, or potentially, the effort that you then put in terms of those risks that have been identified. But maybe any comment you want to add around there, David? Yeah,
I mean, I think often, once you get to the sort of the level of risk maturity that you are focusing the discussion in on that column. So I mentioned, I became a board trustee. Suddenly I was looking at the risk register completely differently. I think once you get to the point where you are focusing in on that column, then the conversation does become around those mitigating actions and the impact that they are having. And often what happens is that you will have board trustees saying, well, look, you're saying that you do all of these things, and yet the gross risk and the net risk are exactly the same. So sometimes there's good reasons for that. Sometimes it's just to do with the external environment that you're operating within. But I think having that challenge process and saying, well, why are we doing all these things when on the face of it, you're saying it's not reducing the impact and it's not reducing the likelihood of this risk crystallizing, it's where board trustees need to be. But as I say, it's having that focus back to what we touched on, particularly ones where there's a big gap between the gross risk and the net risk, because what management are telling you is that by doing these things that we've listed, that is bringing the risk down. But equally, where it's not bringing the risk down, then it's holding them to account and saying, well, why are you doing all these things if on the face of it, it's not having any impact on the likelihood or the impact if the risk was to crystallise.
Okay. Thanks, David. Just checking the clock there, I guess my only or my key SMART objective for today was to chair and finish on time. So I think we're just about there. So I'll thank David and Emma again for that comprehensive and interesting session. Just before we let you go, wanted to highlight the third our next charity trustee training event, which is details of which will be on our website. It's currently booked in November the 17th at the same time of 11 o'clock. The topic there is to cover kind of all things fraud, and Christine Rowland from our forensic accounting team will be in the hot seat to deliver that one. So hopefully we'll see you there. But for now, I hope you found today useful, and thanks very much for joining us. Okay, thank you.